In South Africa, telling the truth about corruption can be a death sentence. The example of that is four hardworking South Africans who chose to speak truth to power, exposing corruption and wrongdoing in government and state-owned companies, reporting fraud, flagging irregular tenders, documenting criminal syndicates looting from public funds. Their killers used the same playbook: surveillance, death threats, hired assassins, and bullets fired in broad daylight. In some cases, arrests were made, and in others, convictions even followed. But in almost every single one of these cases, the powerful figures who order the hits, the mastermind, remain largely untouched, protected by political connections, police corruption, and a justice system that seems designed to fail those who dare challenge the powerful. This is the story of four South African whistleblowers who paid the ultimate price for speaking against corruption. Let's get into it. The first story that we are looking at is that of engineer Armand Swart. Armand Swart was 30 years old at the time of his murder. He was married and had a child, so he was a family man with his life ahead of him. He was an engineer at QTech Engineering Company in Vereeniging. But here's the tragic twist to Armand's story. He wasn't actually even the whistleblower. He was murdered by mistake. The real whistleblower was a colleague of his at QTech, someone who had flagged massive irregularities in Transnet contracts. Here's what QTech's role was in those contracts. So QTech was a seller selling to a middleman that then sold to Transnet. So QTech did not have a contract with Transnet. The person who had a contract with Transnet was Lucky Molefe, the nephew of Katiso Molefe, who will come up a bit later in the story. Lucky's company bought springs from QTech and sold those springs to Transnet. They bought one spring at 390 and sold each spring to Transnet at the highly inflated price of 151 rands. When the whistleblower at QTech made this discovery, he confronted Lucky, informing him that he intends to inform Transnet about these irregularities, about this fraud in the next couple of days if Lucky does not come up with an explanation. Armand Swart was simply the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Professional hitmen had been sent to silence the whistleblower, but instead, through mistaken identity, had killed Armand. On the morning of the 17th of April, 2024, Armand Swart arrived at his workplace at around 6:30 in the morning. As he pulled up at the gate outside QTech premises, a white Hyundai i20 pulled up alongside him. The occupants opened fire. Armand was shot 23 times with a rifle, later identified as an AK-47. He sustained multiple gunshot wounds and was declared dead on the scene. His body slumped in the driver's seat of his own vehicle. The killing sent shock waves through the Vaal community, and within hours, 3 suspects were arrested. The investigation into Armand's murder has revealed one of the most chilling aspects of South Africa's assassination crisis: the involvement of 7 police officers in contract killings. CCTV footage from QTech and other businesses nearby QTech led police on the trail of the Hyundai i20 until it led them to the area of Q in Johannesburg near Bramley and Alexander. Upon arrival at the premises in Q, police found 2 men who were immediately treated as suspects. Michael Buletau, a police detective from Johannesburg Central SAPS, as well as Musake Kana, who was the owner of the property in which the 2 men were found. Tau was quick to identify himself as a police officer and told the police that he knew nothing about what had taken place that morning. He was only there to see his friend, the owner of the place, who is Musake Kana. Outside the gate was Michael Puletau's Mercedes-Benz Viano, which the police searched and found spent cartridges of a rifle, 15 spent cartridges in total. And when he was asked what the spent cartridges were for, the detective indicated that they belonged to his brother, who was a game hunter who had been using the vehicle. Also in that vehicle, police found number plates that would later be linked to another vehicle. Inside the I-20, police found what would later be identified as the murder weapon, an AK-47. So the two men were arrested. However, they were not the only two that police were in search of based on what police observed on the CCTV. The footage also showed a Mercedes-Benz C200 driving up and down the same street a couple of times every hour from about 4 in the morning to around 6:30 when the murder occurred. In addition, police also found footage of a white Mercedes-Benz Viano, which was later confirmed to belong to Puletau, driving around the area of QTech premises days prior to the murder. Police therefore also went on a manhunt for the driver of the C200, and to their luck, the driver, Diego Floyd Mabusela, had a puncture that led to the rim of his car being damaged, and police found and arrested him on R59, not very far from Vereeniging. This was also on the day of the murder of Armand Swart. What police then also discovered was that the number plate that had been found in Michael Puletau's Viano was the correct number plate for this C200. But at the time of the commission of the crime, the C200 had been fitted with fake number plates, so therefore able to tie the three men together as well as to the crime. In addition, police also found that the I-20 that was used in the murder had been a hijacked vehicle, which had been hijacked in January 2024 and fitted with duplicate number plates belonging to an elderly woman. The bulk of the evidence in this case was heard at the Madlanga Commission, a commission of inquiry probing corruption, political interference, and criminal infiltration in the police, intelligence, prosecution, and the judiciary. Witnesses at the Madlanga Commission, Witness A and Witness B, who are investigators whose identities are protected and who now live in safe houses, have provided detailed testimony to the commission regarding this Armand Swart's murder case. According to their testimony, the murder was orchestrated allegedly by Katiso TK Molefe, alleged underworld kingpin and businessman with ties to organized crime syndicates. Just 5 days before Armand Swart's murder, on the 12th of April 2024, Molefe allegedly called police officer Michael Puletau and they spoke for about 2 minutes. Then, Tau called Molefe back on the same day and then arrived at Molefe's luxury residence in Sandhurst shortly after midday of the same day. Later that afternoon, Tau requested the name of the company via WhatsApp. So he sent Molefe a message saying, "What is the name of that company again?" To which Molefe simply responded by saying, QTech. The timeline was damning because on the same day that Katiso Molefe had contacted Michael Puletau and Michael Puletau had gone to the home of Katiso Molefe, this was also on the same day that Lucky Molefe, remember he is Katiso Molefe's nephew and the owner of SK Group, the company that is allegedly selling springs at highly inflated amounts to Transnet, was cornered on the same day by the QTech employee who informed him that he needed an explanation from him or he would be reporting the company to Transnet in the next couple of days. So by the look of it, allegedly, everything moved from that day as instead of sorting out his issues or coming up with a plan of getting out of this one, Lucky Molefe allegedly went to his uncle, Katiso Molefe, seeking a solution for this. And of course, allegedly, Katiso Molefe would contract Detective Michael Puletau and 2 other hitmen to go and kill who they believed was the whistleblower. Over the next 5 days, the MEDA team conducted scouting missions near QTech, profiling what they believed to be the whistleblower. Phone location data, vehicle tracking data, and CCTV footage captured all their movements. Even on the 12th, when Michael Puletau went to go meet with Katiso Molefe, the 2 of them drove together in Molefe's car, allegedly from Molefe's home in Sandhurst to Vereeniging, where they went to go and see the premises of QTech. Cell phone towers point to the 2 of them near QTech premises in Vereeniging and then back together at Katiso Molefe's house. On the morning of the 17th of April, Tau sent a message on WhatsApp at about 8:17 a.m. stating, "Morning abuti, re sharpone," meaning, "Morning brother, we are fine." Investigators believe this was code, confirming that the hitmen were clear and not apprehended. It further suggests that this would have been after the arrival of Puletau and Kekana back in Q, having committed the murder some 2 hours prior. This is how we know from witness A and witness B how Armand Swart's identity became confused with the whistleblower. According to witness B, Lucky Molefe would have given his uncle the name and cell phone number of the suspected QTech whistleblower. Upon this, Katiso Molefe allegedly would have given this information to Michael Puletau. And then Michael Puletau took this information, gave this number to his girlfriend Lerato, and asked her to, in his words, in a WhatsApp message, he says to her, "Here's the number and name. I want you to do your IEC magic. I want you to find out information." I don't know if she worked for IEC or what that was code for, but he wanted her to look for information about the suspected whistleblower. A few minutes later, Lerato replies to Michael Puletau with a photograph of QTech employees saying, "I guess this is them." And that is the information that Michael Puletau used to track down and murder Armand Swart. So the 3, Michael Puletau, Musa Kekana, and Floyd Diego Mabusela, were arrested on the day of the murder, while the suspected mastermind, Katiso TK Molefe, was later arrested in December 2024 at a luxury property in Sandhurst, while his nephew, Lucky Molefe, is still at large, even after multiple police operations to try and catch him in different provinces in the country. He has been missing since December 2024. During a raid at Katiso Molefe's Sandhurst mansion, authorities discovered a trove of sensitive documents, company registration papers, tender applications linked to Transnet, and files related to SK Group. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a page filled with repeated signatures, as if one had been practicing forgeries. In addition, police now also believe that although SK Group was registered to his nephew, Lucky Molefe, it seemed that the real mastermind behind the company and the fraud on Transnet was Katiso Molefe himself. This is in part because all the money coming from Transnet to SK Group was paid into the account of Katiso Molefe's son, Thapelo Molefe, and not his nephew, Lucky Molefe. And even then, Thapelo Molefe was only paid 30,000 rands when the money that came in was millions of rands. And he would have transferred, police believe, the bulk of that money to his father. But it was also Thapelo Molefe who paid salaries of employees, including paying Lucky Molefe, the so-called director to SK Group, was being paid by someone else in the company. Forensic analysts also revealed that the same AK-47 used in Armand Swart's murder was also used in the 2022 assassination of DJ Somebody, whose real name was Oupa Sefoka, and at least 10 other killings, including that of DJ Vintos and Don Tingleni. This confirmed to investigators that they were dealing with a highly sophisticated, highly coordinated syndicate, not an isolated hit. Molefe has denied all wrongdoing, and although his bail was initially denied, he was later granted bail of 400,000 in October 2025 after an appeal. This is despite the state arguing that he was a flight risk with substantial resources and criminal connections. Witness A, in fact, testified at the Madlanga Commission that during the bail hearing, it appeared that the ruling was pre-concluded, with the judge showing little to no interest in the prosecutor's submissions and even assisting Molefe's defense counsel in the bail application. The Madlanga Commission has revealed many allegations of police interference with this particular case, including the alleged involvement of police generals in senior positions in the South African police services. In addition, the witnesses have also suggested that the judge who granted bail to Molefe may have been paid the amount of 2 million rands for his role in releasing Molefe. However, at this point, that remains an allegation. The case against Molefe also remains an allegation, and it remains to be seen who is going to be held accountable, if anyone at all is going to be held accountable for the murder of Armand Swart. The second case that we're going to talk about is that of Jimmy Motlhala, another whistleblower who met his demise way too soon. Jimmy Motlhala was born in 1965 and rose to become the Speaker of the Mbombela local municipality in Mpumalanga, a position that gave him insight into one of the most prestigious events in South African history, the 2010 FIFA World Cup. The Mbombela Stadium, built for the World Cup at the cost of approximately 1.2 billion rands, was meant to be a symbol of national pride, a state-of-the-art facility showcasing South Africa's ability to host world-class sporting events. Instead, Jimmy Motlhala discovered it was a crime scene. In early 2008, Motlhala blew the whistle on alleged tender irregularities involving Jacob Dladla, the Mbombela municipal manager at the time, and the awarding of multi-million rand construction contracts for the 2010 FIFA World Cup stadium. His revelations led to the report by independent lawyers, according to which the municipal manager had led wide-ranging misconduct in relation to contracts regarding 2010. The tenders were reportedly awarded using fraudulent tax clearance certificates. The allegations were extensive: manipulation of tenders, service delivery failures, victimization and harassment of council members, failure to implement council regulations, and failure to keep council informed on matters relating to the World Cup. But Dladla and the contractors allegedly had powerful connections within the ANC. Rather than being praised for exposing corruption, Motlhala found himself under attack from his own party. The ANC began calling for his resignation. They wanted him gone, removed from his position as the speaker, so he could no longer cause trouble by insisting on accountability. But Jimmy Motlhala refused. He refused to resign. He would not be silenced. In 2008, Motlhala received death threats by SMS, but he persisted anyway. The ANC was in the process of taking disciplinary action against him when he was killed. According to reports, Motlhala refused an instruction in December 2008 to convene a council meeting to increase the mayoral committee of Mbombela municipality and to abolish the position of deputy mayor, leading to further fraction between Motlhala and the party. Adding to the murky circumstances, Motlhala himself faced a series of legal charges in 2008, all of which seemed to surface after the ANC's attempt to dismiss him, raising questions about whether any of these charges could have been part of a smear campaign to discredit him as a whistleblower. On the evening of the 4th of January 2009, Jimmy Motlhala was arriving home in the Kanyamazane area outside Mbombela with his 19-year-old son. The two were approaching their gate when they were ambushed by three men wearing balaclavas. These men had been waiting in a vehicle with no number plates. They fired one shot at Jimmy's son, hitting him on the foot. Then, right there in front of him, the hitmen opened fire, hitting Jimmy multiple times. One shot at close range hit him on the chest. Jimmy Motlhala died on his way to the hospital. He was 43 years old. This happened just a week before Motlhala was due to testify at a disciplinary hearing against the municipal manager, Jacob Dladla. The police in Mpumalanga initially claimed they had no clues about who committed the murder. They stated that they were considering political motives, as a robbery did not appear to be a motive. And a spokesperson for the police said they were ruling out the possibility that this could be a politically motivated killing. And on the 4th of October 2010, police arrested 5 suspects in connection with Motlhala's assassination. Jenny Mabika, 58, her son, Sakile, who was 31, Moses Mahungela, 33, and 2 policemen, Musa Finish Mkabela, who was 31, and Dumisani Mhlanga, age 34. The Hawks made a spectacle of themselves by celebrating way too early what they called a breakthrough. The police relied on an affidavit from Mabika's other son, Evans, who gave his testimony about 2 years after the murder of Jimmy Motlhala. Evans claimed that he had witnessed his mother and the 2 men hatching the plot to kill Motlhala, and explained that they even performed traditional medicine rituals in an attempt to send the police on a wild goose chase. However, Evans had, between Motlhala's shooting and becoming a whistleblower, Evans had his own trouble with the police and had been arrested multiple times on charges of theft and other charges. And he would later recant his testimony, stating that he had been under pressure from the police, who said they would drop the charges against him. So the charges against the 4 were dropped in February 2012 due to insufficient evidence, because the entire case relied on the testimony of Evans. The case was widely seen as dubious from the very beginning. Jenny Mabika, who at the time was 59 years old, was regarded as an unlikely suspect for this murder. An unsophisticated 59-year-old single township woman who made a living as a hospital cleaner, according to the commentators at the time, simply did not fit in as a billion-rand tender league player. The matter, therefore, remains unsolved to this day. More than 16 years later, Jimmy Motlhala's killers have still not been held accountable. In August 2012, the Hawks followed up on the tender corruption case, and they arrested 5 men, including Kaizer Chiefs manager Bobby Motaung, whose company, Lifika Emerging Equity, won the tender to design the stadium and was paid over 160 million, despite having charged only 143 million. Former Mbombela municipality manager Jacob Dladla and others were also arrested on fraud charges related to the design and construction of the stadium. The National Prosecuting Authority was certain that they had a winnable case, but there were a lot of bizarre things happening with the NPA. They first transferred the case from the regional court to High Court, and instead of coming up with a new date, the NPA submitted 2 contradicting letters to the regional court, one saying that they wanted to continue at regional court, with another saying that they wanted it to be transferred. And therefore, the charges against Bobby Motaung, Jacob Dladla, and the others were dropped officially in 2023, with the judge indicating that they could reinstate, the NPA could reinstate the case when they got their act together. However, the case was never reinstated. So the World Cup came and went. The Mbombela Stadium hosted matches. Tourists were marveled at the facilities, but Jimmy Mutala was not there to see it. The South African Communist Party has called for Mbombela Stadium to be renamed Jimmy Mutala Stadium. To this day, Jimmy's family awaits justice, but his killers still walk free. If you are intrigued by my storytelling, please like this video. That is one way of letting YouTube know that it's a good video to recommend to more people. Also, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please consider subscribing to our growing community. The next case that we're going to look at today is one that was widely known and talked about in South Africa. And therefore, I'm not going to get into too many details, but will rather summarize the key points in this case. And that is the case of whistleblower Babita Deokaran. Babita Deokaran was 53 years old when she was assassinated. She was a single mother to a teenage daughter and living in Winchester Hill in Joburg South. She was employed as Chief Director of Financial Accounting in the Gauteng Department of Health's Finance Directorate. Babita would sometimes act in the role of CFO, although she reported to Lerato Majo, who was the actual CFO. Lerato's name comes up a bit later in the story. In her position, Babita had access to some of the most sensitive financial records in the province. She was meticulous, professional, and utterly incorruptible, qualities that would later ultimately cost her her life. While doing financial records and auditing, as she usually did, Babita uncovered irregularities in the financial records of Tembisa Hospital. She didn't look the other way, though. She documented everything, compiled evidence which included email exchanges of more than 600 emails and a whole lot of other evidence, which she intended to present to a special investigating unit. The numbers were staggering. Approximately 850 million in suspicious payments from Tembisa Hospital to various service providers through tenders. Much of this was linked to the COVID-19 personal protective equipment PPE tenders. Tenderpreneurs profiteering from a pandemic where healthcare workers were dying for lack of proper protection. Upon being sure that there were a lot of shady dealings with tenders at Tembisa Hospital, Babita halted payments of close to 100 million rands to different companies involved in the tenders, while hoping that the Special Investigating Unit would have more investigations and potentially make arrests. Babita understood the danger that she was putting herself under, even expressing to her boss, Gauteng Department of Health CFO at the time, Lerato Majo, that she feared for her life, to which Lerato reassured her that she is going to seek the approval to have an investigation in this matter. However, it was later discovered that Lerato had not actually sought approval for anyone to investigate anything. Instead, she allegedly kept quiet about this. And after Babita's murder, those funds equaling to close to 100 million that Babita had halted were released to those different companies who were allegedly involved in defrauding the hospital. On the morning of the 23rd of August 2021, Babita dropped her daughter off at school and returned home to her residence in Winchester Hill, her domestic worker seated beside her in the passenger seat. As she pulled into her driveway and brought her car to a halt, a vehicle pulled up beside her. Multiple shots rang out, and Babita was hit repeatedly. A passenger witnessed the horror, but miraculously survived with minor injuries. Babita survived until she got to the hospital, where her family was called to her bedside, and she would take her last breath with her family by her side. A whistleblower silenced forever. The investigation moved with unusual speed, at least initially. Within 4 days of the murder, 6 suspects were arrested. On the 27th of August, a neighbor of Babita had seen a suspicious BMW repeatedly circling the area in the days before the killing. This information would prove to be very crucial. The passenger in Babita's vehicle also provided crucial evidence that helped identify the killers. The 6 men that were arrested were Phakamani Radebe, Ntlangani Ndlovu, Sanele Mbele, Phakanyiswa Dladla, Zita Radebe, and Siphiwe Mazibuko, all of which hailed from KZN, a province that unfortunately has become known for supplying hitmen for hire. The men were also linked to the taxi and transport industry, a sector that also is well documented for having connections to assassination syndicates. According to their plea agreement, which they took when they all pleaded guilty in this case, they were recruited by another man named Khanyisani Mpongose, who was known to Phakamani Radebe through being employed in the taxi industry. The murder was both methodical and professional. The killers had surveilled Babita's home and workplace, taking photographs of her house and vehicle, which they sent to Mpongose, who would become the eventual shooter. On the morning of the 23rd of August 2021, Mpongose arrived with an unknown male accomplice. They followed Babita in 2 separate vehicles from Columbine Square to her home, waited for her to stop, and opened fire. Exactly 2 years after Babita's murder, on the 22nd of August 2023, all the 6 men that had been caught, remember Mpongose and the unknown male accomplice, have not been caught, but the others who were involved all pleaded guilty, and they entered into a plea agreement with the NPA and received differentiated sentences based on their roles. Radebe got the sentence of 22 years for his role in the murder. Mbele was also sentenced to 22 years. Radebe was sentenced to 15 years. Mazibuko to 15 years as well. And then there was Dladla, who was sentenced to 8 years for murder and 7 years for firearm offenses. And then finally there was Ndlovu, who was sentenced to only 6 years for his role in the assassination of Babita Deokaran. The 6 men apologized to Babita's family in their plea deal, but Babita's brother Rakesh rejected the apology, saying that what made this even more sad was that 5 out of the 6 men had children, but they had felt nothing, taking Babita away from her child who needed her, and their apology was subsequently not accepted by the family. But here's the devastating truth. The actual shooters who fired the fatal shots, Mpongose and the unknown assailant, were never arrested and remain at large. Most importantly, the mastermind, the person who ordered Babita Deokaran's assassination, has never been identified or charged. During the trial proceeding, one of the accused made an explosive claim that former Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize, had paid them 400,000 each for the hit of Babita Deokaran. He would later recant his statement, claiming it was obtained under coercion. The allegation, of course, was never proven. The Special Investigating Unit has uncovered multiple criminal syndicates operating within the Gauteng Department of Health, looting through tenders from Tembisa Hospital and other facilities. In 2025, Vusimuzi Ket Matlala, whose companies received millions from Tembisa Hospital for goods and services, was arrested, though notably on other charges rather than charges related to the Tembisa Hospital corruption or even perhaps the murder of Babita Deokaran. Instead, he stands accused of the attempted murder of Slay Queen Tebogo Tobejane, with whom he had previously been romantically linked. It is alleged that on the 17th of October 2023, while leaving a restaurant in Bryanston, Tebogo's vehicle was fired at and she was shot in the foot. Those claiming some knowledge of the story allege that Tebogo apparently knew too much. While in the relationship with Ket Matlala, he may have confessed to the murder, to hiring hitmen to murder Babita Deokaran, or rather that there was information that reached her ears because of her proximity to Vusi Ket Matlala, that she knew too much and he sought to eliminate her so as to eliminate any evidence linking him to the murder of Babita Deokaran. Matlala has also, as you are aware, been implicated in other alleged crimes, including the kidnapping of businessman Jerabo Shoha, as well as being involved, allegedly, in the multi-billion rand Big Five syndicate, where the suspended police minister Senzo Mchunu is also implicated. But as things stand, the police have not implicated Ket Matlala in the murder of Babita Deokaran. Babita's family has been very clear. They will never have closure until the mastermind is identified and prosecuted. They want justice for Babita, and that means finding out who ordered the hit. It remains to be seen whether the real mastermind will ever be brought to book. The last story that I want us to look at in the series of stories of whistleblowers who paid the ultimate price is that of Moss Phakwe, who was 52 years old when he was murdered. Born in 1956, Moss was an ANC councillor in the Rustenburg municipality. He was also a dedicated trade unionist with the Congress for South African Trade Unions and a shop steward for the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. He had been a member of the ANC from its underground days, and in the early 1990s became a shop steward while working at a factory in Bratz. His colleagues and comrades remember him as someone who valued fighting for liberation over personal gratification. Together with his friend and colleague and confidant Alfred Mutsi, Phakwe uncovered extensive evidence of corruption, fraud, nepotism, and mismanagement of funds in the Bojanala Platinum District municipality in the Northwest Province. The documents that the two compiled documented multi-million rand fraud, including allegations of corruption related to the outsourcing of management of the Rustenburg Kloof, a council-owned resort. Phakwe and Mutsi didn't just report the corruption to local authorities. They also took it to the highest level of the ANC. In the months leading up to his murder, Phakwe had either met or phoned several ANC leaders on numerous occasions in an effort to get them to stop the rot he had uncovered in Rustenburg municipality. And in December 2008, Phakwe and Mutsi went to Nkandla, KZN, to the home of the then President Jacob Zuma himself. After that meeting, ANC Secretary General at the time, Gwede Mantashe, invited Phakwe and Mutsi to a meeting in January in 2009. This meeting would be held in Potchefstroom. The ANC's top 6 leadership were present at the meeting, as well as provincial leadership. Also present was a man named Matthew Wolmarans, the mayor of Rustenburg at the time. And he was one of the key figures implemented in Phakwe's corruption allegations. According to Motsi, Mantashe scorned him as a troublemaker and that the ANC leadership did little to stop Wolmarans, who appeared to be untouchable at that point. Mantashe later denied some of these details, though he admitted to speaking to Motsi several times before the murder. The late Sicelo Shigeka, then Minister of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs, was also asked by ANC leaders to investigate the allegations, and on the 12th of March 2009, Phakwe and Motsi met with Minister Shigeka and handed him a detailed dossier of evidence containing allegations of corruption amounting to millions of rands. Wolmarans was also present at this meeting. According to Motsi's testimony during the subsequent murder trial, when Phakwe told Shigeka about the evidence of the dodgy Rustenburg Kloof deal, Wolmarans' face immediately changed. And according to evidence later presented in court, Phakwe told the mayor at the meeting, "Hate me, but don't hurt me." 2 days later, on the evening of the 14th of March 2009, 2 days after the meeting with the Minister of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs, Mos Phakwe returned home to Rustenburg North. He had just come back from putting up election posters for the ANC ahead of the 2009 general elections. As he parked his car in his driveway, he was shot at close range. His body was found slumped over the steering wheel of his BMW, killed just 2 days after handing over the dossier to a government minister in the presence of the very man he was accusing. Mos Phakwe was a father of 3, and he died trying to do the right thing. Following a lengthy investigation, the NPA brought Matthew Wolmarans and his former bodyguard Enoch Machaba to trial for Phakwe's murder. The prosecution argued that Wolmarans had masterminded the killing, while Machaba was responsible for the actual shooting. Wolmarans was arrested on the 24th of September 2011, together with Amos Matabure and Oupa Mpomane, and the charges against Matabure and Mpomane were dropped during the first week of the trial, leaving only Wolmarans and his bodyguard, Machaba, as the accused in this murder. Throughout the trial, which ran until 2012, evidence revealed that Wolmarans viewed Phakwe as his adversary and a major threat to his political power in the municipality. Machaba, it was established, had simply followed orders when he shot the councillor. On the 17th of July 2012, Judge Ronnie Hendricks handed down the verdict in the Northwest High Court, sitting in Rustenburg. He found both men guilty. Addressing Wolmarans, the judge was unequivocal, stating, "The deceased was your rival. He challenged you on things he did not like. He accused you of corruption, and that angered you." Hendricks said that because Wolmarans saw Phakwe as an opponent, he plotted to kill him. "You employed the services of the accused number 1, Machaba, to eliminate the deceased." Machaba was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Wolmarans received a sentence of 20 years. Outside court, Phakwe's supporters, dressed in red t-shirts, celebrated the sentencing by singing liberation songs. It seemed finally that justice had been served. However, the story does not end there. The pair immediately applied for leave to appeal their convictions. This was initially refused by the Northwest High Court. They persisted, taking the case to the Supreme Court of Appeal. While waiting for the ruling, they applied for bail and were released on bail of 100,000 rands each. In 2014, 5 years after the murder, the Supreme Court of Appeal overturned both convictions. The 3 judges who presided over the matter had found that The court that convicted Wolmarans and Mashaba failed to ensure that the case was properly investigated and rather relied on information that could not be corroborated and failed to show the leads that could have disproved the men's alleged involvement in the murder. The reason, a key witness, a man named Emmanuel Masoka, who had shared a prison cell with Wolmarans while awaiting trial, had recanted his testimony. Masoka had previously implicated Wolmarans in the murder, claiming that Wolmarans had confessed to him, but later recanted it in an affidavit, claiming that police had offered him money and to drop the theft charges against him if he implicated Wolmarans. After serving only about a year of his sentence, Matthew Wolmarans was acquitted and released, and so was his former bodyguard. Both men walked free. The case, therefore, is another one of those that remain unsolved, as neither the hitman or mastermind or masterminds have been arrested and convicted for their role. That is it for today's video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, which is sure to generate an interesting debate about this topic of whistleblowing in South Africa. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next one.